had a customer come to me recently with a Fender Stratocaster with a tremolo bridge, and the bridge was constantly falling way out of tune for him, and that's because the holes that held the bushings for the bridge in place were way blown out in the front. And as a solution to that, he took it to a friend, and the friend put this door jam contraption on there, which was kind of clever. He, drilled 2 holes into a hardware store door jamb and nailed that in place, or screwed that in place. And what that did was, it didn't really solve the problem of the excess tension that caused the holes to blow out in the first place. All it did was it transferred that energy over a broader area, which then caused that whole area to split in 2 places on either side of the bridge, about where those holes are located. Hopefully you can see it in this picture, but the split runs back here, goes through the hole out to the front, and there's another split on the other side right about here. It also runs out to the front. And this whole section in the middle can easily be pulled up with just light finger pressure underneath. And then, so the down tuning that this person was experiencing was a result of every time he would tune up those strings, the tremolo bridge not only had the tremolo system attached to it with the springs, but it was also fighting the fact that the wood itself was separated, and the wood itself would pull up a little bit. So he was constantly battling that down tuning effect, and it really just wasn't a playable guitar. So anyway, without further ado, I thought this would be a fun repair to have you guys follow along and just kind of show you my thought process for approaching this unique repair. First, I want to get a clear idea of where the outline of the pickguard ends. That's why I lay down some painter's tape around the pickguard and very carefully scribe the excess tape off with a number 11 razor blade. I want to clearly see where the pickguard sits so that I can plan my cuts so that they stay to the inside of the pickguard. I remove the pickguard and tape off the wires and potentiometers to the side so that they're out of the way. It's possible that the wires may still get in the way of the router base later, and in that case I'll just have to use a soldering iron to release the connections and then resolder them back later, but I'd rather not do that if I don't have to. I mark out the wood that I intend to remove. I want the patch to extend into the body of the guitar and make as much contact across the area as I can get away with, without becoming visible outside of the pickguard line. The patch has to bridge across the damaged area and have a secure joint with the other, more solid parts of the body. You'll notice later that I don't remove the material in the triangle-shaped area at the top of the screen. This is simply because as I progressed, I decided that it wasn't really necessary. To mark out the depth, I use a marking gauge. Because the outside edges of the bushing holes are blown out, I want to mark the depth all the way down to the bottom of those holes to remove all that damaged material. However, at the bottom of the holes, there is a whole mess of what looks like steel epoxy, probably part of the previous attempt to solve the problem. Whatever it is, I don't want it to ruin my tools, so for now I'm going to mark the depth just above that area. The blown out edges of the holes are just barely hanging on. I carefully pop them out with a chisel and put those pieces of wood aside because I might need them later. Now, before I get started removing the material, I measure and make a note of the depth of the recessed area where the tremolo bridge will sit, because I'll have to route that recess later. Now, I could use a router to remove most of this material, but I'd rather just remove it with hand tools. In the time it would take me to set up the router and set up fences for the router, I could already have the job done with just a saw and some good sharp chisels. Here I'm using a curved mini saw with a piece of wood as a fence to cut right down to my line to the depth that I've marked out. The curve of the saw just helps me to get into this tight space and cut precisely where I want it to cut without the saw inadvertently cutting anything else, like say the wires that are right next to where I'm cutting. The cut is very deep, and so the saw starts to bind up a little bit. So rather than cutting all the way down to the depth right now, I'll start chiseling out the material and then finish the depth cut after some of the material is relieved. Now I start chiseling out across the area where the tremolo sits. I transfer that depth mark I made across the tremolo area using a piece of wood to rest the marking gauge on. After removing all the material down to depth, I carefully removed as much of the epoxy material in the holes as I could with a pick, and then I chiseled the whole area down to a new depth, which is very close to the depth of the bottom of the holes, but not quite there. Now, to make it possible to get a good fitting joint here, I used the chisel to nip away at all inside corners. There should be a gap or negative space in all the corners. I've cut a piece of mahogany to the approximate shape that I need. The first stage of fitting is simply by eye. I check the fit and then carefully chisel out material to see how close I can get the surfaces to mate. Once the fit is close, I attach 120 grit sandpaper to the mating surfaces of the block. Because I am up against a corner on the one side, I sand with very short strokes. It's a good idea to patch in any damaged areas before fitting the joint, so I took a break from sanding and used the blown out edge pieces that I saved to patch in those areas. There was another torn out area that I wanted to patch on the other side of the hole. This area I did not have the piece of wood that was torn out, so I would have to make a patch. First, I carefully cleaned up the area with a chisel, I cut the vertical edges square, and I shaped the concavity into a wedge shape. All of these things just make it easier to get a good fit with my patch. I held tracing paper against the concavity and traced the edges. Then I attached the tracing paper to a piece of scrap wood with double stick tape. I cut along the lines with a jeweler's saw. This gets the filler piece really close to the exact shape of the concavity. I can then check and adjust the fit carefully with a needle file. When it's ready to go, I dab some glue in the space and wedge the piece in. The wedging action makes it a nice tight fit. It doesn't hurt to add a clamp here too if I can fit it. Now I can continue fine-tuning the fit by sanding. Once I see that there are sanding scratches on all parts of the joint, then I remove the sandpaper, swap it out for 220, sand the joint just a little bit smoother, and then it's ready to go. Just to be even more sure that there's nothing hanging up the fit in the corners, I round over the inside corners on my block just slightly. The fit is good and it's ready for glue. I let that sit overnight, and now I'm leveling the block with the surrounding body. Once it's level, I mark out the recess for the tremolo bridge. Now I route out the recess. Since I was routing freehand without a fence, I did not route all the way to the ends. Also, the size of the base of the router limited how far I could route before the base would fall into the recess that I was creating. No worries though, I routed as much as I could and then used a chisel to walk the rest of the material out to the ends. Before drilling the holes for the bushings, I drilled test holes in a separate piece of mahogany in order to determine precisely the right drill bit for these bushings. I made sure that I drilled all the way through the test piece so that I could tap the bushings out with a mallet and a screwdriver afterwards. And that's it. Now that I have the holes drilled, I can put the pick guard back together and we can string this thing up, give it a setup, tune it up, and see how it plays. Once I finish tuning this up and give it a little bit of a setup, it's actually at a pretty good setting how it is right now, then this will be done and I can consider this operation to the tremolo area a success.